Welcome to NCIX Tech Tips. Today's episode is about the MSI Radeon HD 7870 Hawk. So if you're already familiar with Hawk Edition cards, then there might not be a lot of surprises here, although MSI has added new features that weren't present on Hawk Edition cards. Quick summary of Hawk cards. They use custom coolers, custom PCBs, and have a shed load of overclocking features. So we're going to show you guys how to use them, as well as the performance of this card compared to the competition. Now when it comes to general spec, the 7870 Hawk Edition is, well, okay, it's kind of special. It's got a 7870 GPU, okay? It's got 2 gigs of RAM. It's overclocked, so a factory overclock. So the spec is pretty interesting. However, where we really get into what's cool about this card is actually when it comes to things like the cooling and the design of the PCB overall. So we start out with a dual 80mm fan cooler that actually has MSI's anti-dust technology, meaning it spins the wrong way for a second in order to throw away the dust before it starts up. This makes a big difference over time, as we've actually seen in gaming machine demos in the NCIX retail store. So it actually does work, even though it seems like a fairly simple thing. It also uses 5 heat pipes, including 2 super pipes, to carry heat away from the GPU and toward the outside of an enormous aluminum fin radiator that covers the entire top of the card. Now the top of the card also has a heat spreader that covers all of the components, including the memory and the VRM. This allows us to keep those components cool, which you'll actually be able to monitor in MSI Afterburner exactly what temperatures that they're running at. So that's pretty neat as well. Last but not least, on the back, we find again a full back plate. Once again, this is for cooling. This will keep the card running cool. I know I'm sort of emphasizing that a lot. Running cool even when you're overclocking, and especially during intensive gaming sessions. Now some of the other things about this card, again, it has in common with other 7870s. For example, the 2 6-pin PCI Express connectors, the Crossfire connector, the BIOS switch that allows you to use a different BIOS should you so desire, is a bit of a unique one though, because not all 7870s have it. Outputs are pretty standard: DVI, HDMI, and dual mini display ports, and it does use PCI Express 3.0 for its interface with the computer. Now in terms of cooling, the Hawk delivers, check this out. So at our default settings here, we have a core temperature of only 30 degrees, memory temperature of 36 degrees, and VRM temperatures of 37 degrees. So the other cool thing about this card is not only that it's keeping everything really cool in our warm studio here, but also the fact that it even gives you the option of monitoring the temperatures of those different components in MSI Afterburner. Also, it does feature more overvolting options than a default card will. Not only can you adjust the core voltage, but also memory voltage, which is normal, and even the auxiliary voltage, which can be helpful for reaching the highest possible clock speeds. Now we're going to show you our load temperatures once we fire up Crysis 2 here in just a moment. So we've got our game running now, guys. So we're running at okay, you know what, I'll have to show you the detail settings after, because I think we're on ultra with high-res textures, and basically it's just like everything cranked up to the 9s. So we're getting around 40 FPS. So most people are pretty comfortable with that kind of a frame rate, even in action-packed scenes where the FPS is dipping a little bit. We're not seeing under around 40 FPS, which is pretty good. So you can see that in the top right corner. I'm using Fraps to monitor it. And this guy's not dead. There we go. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to close down the game after, of course, checking what detail levels we're running on. I should know this. Everything ultra, high-res textures, yes. All right. So that gives you some idea of the performance of the card, which is pretty darn good. Now we're going to shut her down and see how we did in terms of temperatures. So the GPU went up to around 66 degrees before it started to top out there, and the VRM and memory were around 52 and 60 degrees. So all of these are very acceptable temperatures given a real-life gaming scenario. Now, other than the cooling, which is obviously a factor for overclocking, what else has MSI done to optimize this card for overclocking? Well, besides their software, Afterburner, which is awesome and happens to not only work on MSI cards, but also other cards, which is obviously very generous of them. And besides the cooling, besides the, well, I mean, cooling is sort of the biggest thing for overclocking. Besides all of that, MSI has a completely custom PCB on this board, custom to the point where I've seen very few cards in the past that are this custom. I mean, something like their GTX 580 Lightning that had like this, like a much larger than normal PCB. That's the kind of custom we're talking here, except on a bit of a smaller scale because this is a more mid-range GPU compared to like a 580 was at the time. So check this out. On the back of the card, you've got what's called the GPU reactor. There's a plastic cover over it that just, shows through some blue LED lights and stuff. We should have some close-ups of that in the video somewhere. And here is this little daughter board PCB that you can actually take off, just like that. So what MSI has done is they have, okay, you can only put so many components on the back of the PCB before you run out of space. And more components on the back of the PCB allows you to deliver more power, it allows you to deliver cleaner power, and so that's better for overclocking, especially if you're going to do dry ice or liquid nitrogen overclocking. So MSI has built in this daughter board to give you, to cheat and make more space directly on the back of the GPU for more power circuitry. So that is the GPU reactor. Make sure if you install it correctly. And I'm just going to go ahead and line this back up and put that back on. But I think that that is a phenomenally cool feature, especially for the extreme overclockers out there. So yes, they've gone ahead, they've put a beefier power design, a better cooler, and all the usual stuff you see on an overclocked SKU, and then they've taken it one step further with GPU reactor. Now in terms of performance, the most important thing to note is that without costing a whole lot more than a regular 7870, the Hawk delivers more overclocking features and slightly better performance at stock. So it's only at about 1.1 gigahertz, which, given that we've seen user reviews of it going up to around 1.35, 1.4 gigahertz, isn't even close to what its potential is. Okay, so let's have a look at our Crysis 2 performance. In Crysis 2, it beats this regular 7870, which stands to reason, and it falls just shy of the 7950. Now, this is a bit of a win for NVIDIA because the GTX 670 does perform better than these AMD equivalents, but that's not necessarily always the case. So we're going to focus more on how it falls in with the rest of the AMD product stack. And in Battlefield 3, we see, again, a very similar story where the Hawk outperforms its vanilla cousin by just a little bit and then falls just shy of the 7950. So given where the pricing is positioned, it pretty much makes sense. But again, this one was a bit of a win for NVIDIA. So if you are looking for an AMD graphics card, you want to be able to overclock it, you want it to run cool and look cool, then the Hawk is not a bad option for sure. So thank you for checking out this episode of NCIX Tech Tips, and don't forget to subscribe.